Hey everyone, and welcome to my first video about evolution. I'm going to start this series by explaining what evolution actually is, along with a little history, and then I'll give a very simplified example of evolution occurring. Now, please keep in mind that this is very simplified, and while the folks studying this stuff for a living are very, very highly educated and have a huge amount of information about the details of biology, the level of education that you need to actually understand the basics of this stuff is really only about high school. So a little history first about evolutionary theory. Darwin did not come up with the theory of evolution. This was actually an old idea even in Darwin's day. The issue with it was really the fact that no one had been able to come up with any type of idea of how evolution could happen. So there was this notion that different species were connected. A lot of times it was just morphological similarities. So in other words, you can look at any mammalian skeleton. They're all really the same. The only difference is really the size of the bones, but the positioning and the number of bones really doesn't vary much from one mammal to another. But how they were connected, how different species could actually change form that drastically, no one had any idea. So the theory was never given any weight. But what Darwin did was come up with the theory of natural selection. And this answers the question of how does this type of change occur. And by doing so, Darwin actually provided us with an entirely new way to look at the world. So natural selection is the key here, and that's what I'm going to be describing. But before I begin, I really want to make one thing very, very clear, and that's natural selection is a blind process. There is no goal, there is no design, nothing like that. It simply occurs, nothing more. Now, for it to occur, there are actually only two conditions. And a bit unintuitively, although I think of great importance, once these two conditions are met, evolution is inevitable. So condition one is variation within a population. Now, and also note that this is within a population, not within a species. Natural selection does not have to work on a species level, and most of the time it doesn't. It works on a population level, a subset of that population that happens to be exposed to a particular environmental pressure. The one species can in fact be spread out in a very large area, be exposed to various different things, and actually evolve in different ways based on the conditions that they encounter. Now, variation itself is, in multicellular organisms, is fairly straightforward. It's fairly easy to see. For instance, I have a distinct lack of pigmentation in my cells. I'm a certain height, my hair is a certain color, my eyes suck. But in other respects, variation can be very, very subtle, and it can be actually undetectable almost with our present amount of technology. So things like immune system strength or memory capability, empathy, that type of thing. But the key is that there is variation in just about any aspect of an organism that you can name. The same type of thing exists for single-celled organisms. It's obviously harder to see, harder to detect, measure, that type of thing, but the variation is still present. So for instance, the exact chemical makeup of the cellular fluid may change from one organism to another. There are actually thousands and thousands of little variations that can occur on any given cell. So we have variation, but how do these variations occur? There are actually a number of ways, and if you're interested, you can always Google this type of stuff. You'll find all kinds of articles on how genetic variation or genetic drift, that type of thing, can occur in a species. But I'm going to go through two simple ways here. The first is copying errors in DNA, and the second is viruses. So when a cell divides, there's a process that it goes through to replicate its DNA. So each of the daughter cells gets a complete copy of its genetic code. This is great, obviously, but it is not a perfect process. There are errors that can be made, and the DNA in each of these daughter cells is not always the same as the host or each other. This can be good, this can be bad, it can not matter at all, but it is variation. It can cause changes from one generation to the next in how an organism can deal with its environment. For some organisms, this actually can be a survival strategy as well. For HIV, for instance, has a very high rate of errors when it's copying its DNA. And this can lead to a lot of non-viable cells, but it also leads occasionally to a cell that's immune to a lot of the drugs that we throw at it. And this is why HIV actually is so difficult to get rid of. It's basically, it evolves very, very quickly, and that helps it avoid a lot of the drugs and a lot of the treatments that we've come up with. For viruses, virus is a strange little thing, actually. It does not have the capability to reproduce on its own. In order to reproduce, it actually has to infect a host cell. And when it does this, it actually injects its own DNA into the host cell and lets that host cell's internal workings take over and replicate that DNA, create new copies of the virus. Eventually the cell dies, it opens up, and all these copies of the virus are free, and it goes over to infect other cells. But sometimes the process doesn't go quite so smoothly. Very things in biology do. Sometimes only part of the DNA gets injected into the cell, or sometimes the virus gets destroyed before it can complete the infection process. Sometimes the DNA that gets injected into the cell just doesn't get read the way it has been in the past. There's a number of ways this type of thing can happen, but the end result here is that it can be that part of the virus's DNA gets integrated into the host cell's DNA without actually killing the host. So when it reproduces, when it splits, that DNA gets copied along with the rest of its DNA, and it just gets integrated into the host cells. Now, please note that both of these methods of change of a DNA strand can lead to new information. Okay, so in other words, information can be added. Okay, this is an absolutely inane argument that I hear all the time against evolution. That you can't add information to a DNA chain. The mutations can only change what's there. They can remove information. They can't add any information. It's stupid. It's garbage. And anybody making this type of argument obviously does not understand the basics of biology involved. So just don't listen to it. You can easily research this stuff for yourself. It's not that difficult for DNA information or genetic information to be added to a DNA strand. It is possible. It's not complicated. So that's condition 1, variation. Condition 2 is environmental pressure. Now, just like the variations, some of the pressures are obvious, some of them are subtle. But it is a critical part of natural selection. So, what qualifies as an environmental pressure? Really, a very simplified way of looking at it is it's anything that can kill you. More specifically, it's anything that can prevent an organism from reproducing. So stuff like a predator, harsh winter, disease, and less obvious stuff could be something like, the ear canal in a semi-aquatic animal doesn't drain water easily. So when it gets out of the water, predator may be able to sneak up on it because it can't hear very well. Something like that. Ultimately, there are millions of different environmental pressures on every organism at all times. Even you, believe it or not. We're not aware of them because for the most part our bodies, our DNA, we're adapted to this environment that we live in. So we can handle all this stuff without a problem. But, there are millions of different bacteria and viruses in our environment that we don't really pay much attention to. And we have the ability to control our environment to some extent as well, right? If it's cold, you could turn up the heat. It's hot, turn on the air conditioning. Not a big deal. We can deal with that type of thing. So the next question is, what happens when you combine these two factors? What happens when you take the variability that exists in the genetic code from one organism to the next and combine that with the environmental pressure that an organism can be under? Well, this is where you get natural selection occurring. You have some members of a population being better adapted to an environmental pressure or better able to deal with that pressure than other members, which means they're less likely to die. And the genetic code that they possess that allows them to be more adapted to this particular pressure is more likely to be passed on, and thus it gets concentrated in the next generation. That's the essence of natural selection. So I'm going to go through a very, very basic example here. And warning, there's a little bit of math involved. So say we have a population of 100 single-celled organisms. These organisms have, say, a 75% chance to survive in a particular saline solution. But 10 of these cells have a variation. They have a 90% chance to survive this same saline solution. So the variation here is in their ability to survive in this salty environment, and the environmental pressure is the salt itself. And we'll also assume, just for simplicity's sake, that if an organism survives, it splits and basically has 2 offspring. So for generation 1, you have 100 cells, 10 of which have this saline resistance, and 90 cells without it. So of the 90 cells, 75% of them, which is 67, survive and split. So you have 134 offspring. Of the 10 cells with this gene, you have 9 survivors, and then you have 18 of them, or you have 18 offspring. So you could keep doing this generation after generation, but what you'll find is even after just 2 generations, that your percentage-wise, the number of organisms in this population that have this gene has gone up from 10% to about 13.8. So it's already increased. It's not a huge change. It's not a huge jump, but I mean, evolution is not a fast process. It takes time. It takes generations to compound on themselves, really to start expressing or concentrating these genes, these attributes, and thus show them in any kind of meaningful way. But if we skip ahead, say to the 10th generation, well then 35% of the population will have this gene. So that's a pretty big jump. If we go ahead 100 generations, just about every organism in this population, over 99.999%, will have this gene. And that's evolution. That's all it is. It's just a trait that allows certain organisms in a population to survive being concentrated in the next generation. That's it. So hopefully by now you have a decent grasp of the basics of how natural selection occurs. That's really all there is. Now, if you're still unclear, you could go back, watch the video again. If you want to ask questions, please, feel free to do so. This is stuff that isn't that complicated, but it's not very intuitive either. And I think that's a big part of why people have such a hard time understanding it. At least people who are willing to make the effort to understand it. Ultimately, though, there's no question. I mean, as Bill Nye's book says, it's undeniable. This happens. We can observe it. We can see it happening. There are experiments that show this happening. It really, really is undeniable. So the next video, I'm going to go into a couple of real-world examples, and after that I'll get into some of the arguments, some of the more common arguments that I've seen against evolution, and why they just don't hold any water at all. So thanks for watching, everybody, and if you have any questions, let me know.